Well, good morning, everybody. I see people are still filtering in. I do want to kind of start on time, though. We're going to have a pretty lengthy panel discussion here. It could get pretty wild. So, we want to make sure we have enough time here. So this is the second session of our Smart Cities Forum today. My name's Larry O'Brien. I'm Vice President of Research at ARC Advisory Group. I work on the Smart Cities team, and I also work on the industrial and OT level cybersecurity team at ARC. And what we are doing today is having an open panel discussion on cybersecurity and smart cities and smart buildings. Um, Joel Rakow, I want to thank you for helping me put this together because, I first became aware of this particular group of people, or most of you anyway, through a previous podcast that Joel did. I thought it was great. So we brought some more people on board and kind of expanded it. And we have a lot to talk about today because cybersecurity in smart cities and smart buildings, at least in our opinion, has a little bit of a ways to go to become a little more mature, and we're facing an increasing amount of threats that are becoming more complex and more sophisticated. And many of these are directly aimed at the OT level. And as you probably know, if you've been reading the news, smart cities and especially smart buildings in the built environment have been big targets for cyber attacks over the past couple of years, and that seems to be only increasing right now. So we have a lot of questions lined up. I do want to take questions from the audience today. So if you look at the bottom of your screen in your Zoom window, you will see a Q&A button there. We would like you to enter your questions into that Q&A, and we'll ask the panel. We do have a chat button, which is for the attendees, and it's okay to use. But for questions for the panel, we're going to be looking at that Q&A button. So please make sure you put your questions in there. I want to start by briefly introducing our panelists today. We do have an esteemed panel of experts here in the world of cybersecurity focused on smart cities and smart buildings. First off, we have Fred Gordy. Morning, Fred. Fred is Director of Cybersecurity for Intelligent Buildings. He's an industry expert of cybersecurity for building control and power monitoring systems. His control systems knowledge gives him insight on challenges of interlacing traditional IT environments with control systems, something I know we're going to talk more about in this panel discussion. For a cohesive and secure operational technology platform, Fred has over 20 years of experience in the building automation system space, over 7 years of BAS cybersecurity experience, and is nationally recognized as a cybersecurity thought leader and speaker. After Fred, we have Joel Rakow, who is, as I mentioned, is sort of the father of this session today. So good morning, Joel. Joel is a partner at Fortium Partners. He's a technology executive providing thought leadership for securing building systems against cyber attack. He is a CISO and partner at Fortium Partners in the domain of cybersecurity for building Internet of Things. That's IoT in the built environment. He serves as a subject matter expert for the building automation division at ISA as well. He originated the Never Cry cyber defense for third-party suppliers of building systems and the electronic crime and risk management practice for a national consulting company. He's also a former member of PSA's cybersecurity committee for 400 plus suppliers of building systems. Joel is a former Harvard University fellow, a National Science Foundation undergraduate fellow, and a Microsoft Partner Award winner. And next we have Anthony Veri, who's the Director for Smart Cities and Wireless Mobility at Integrated Network Concepts. Anthony has over 18 years of experience in communications and IT, and his last 5 years have been focusing on smart technology, wireless networks, and of course, cybersecurity. Having a Lean Six Sigma black belt, he leverages lean and continuous improvement methodologies to drive smart decision-making, new efficiencies, and reduce defects and waste. Anthony and his company is vendor agnostic, which opened the doors for the best solution for planning and design when it comes to smart cities and smart buildings. We also have John Contestable. He's Director of Public Safety Solutions. Hi, John, for Skyline Technology Solutions. John works closely with the public safety community, providing consulting services and solutions to help meet their operational needs. These solutions can involve cybersecurity, video interoperability, communications, and network operations. He joined Skyline in 2019 after 10 years with Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Lab, where he was program manager for Homeland Security Emergency Response Systems. And in that capacity, he worked with various government sponsors like DHS and CISA and FEMA to develop technology projects to meet their needs, rather related to transportation security, critical infrastructure resilience, and interoperable communications. Um, well, good morning, gentlemen. We also have Richard Hayton. Oh, I don't want to forget about Richard. Richard is Chief Strategy and Innovation Officer at Trustonic. So with over 30 years in the cybersecurity industry, Richard is a regular speaker and influencer in the cybersecurity arena. And at Trustonic, Richard's focus has been on enabling the telecoms industry, manufacturers and mobile operators in the automotive industry, as well as application developers to all benefit from embedded cybersecurity and strong device identity. And prior to Trustonic, he held various roles at Citrix, including chief architect, distinguished engineer, and chief technology officer. And during his 20 years at Citrix, he led projects ranging from embedded software to global enterprise systems, with a focus on user and developer experience. So again, good morning, gentlemen. I think we have an excellent panel here, obviously with loads of experience and leadership in cybersecurity. You can all go off mute now because I think we're all just going to start talking here. We have a lot of questions lined up because cybersecurity is so important for smart cities and smart buildings right now. And I think in many ways, this is kind of a nascent field. To me, smart cities and the built environment or smart buildings or whatever you want to call them are a bit behind. I've been tracking the industrial sector and manufacturing for over 20 years. And to me, it almost seems like smart cities and buildings are kind of where manufacturing was maybe 10 or, 10 plus years ago in terms of deciding what to do about cybersecurity as far as building it into products, as far as adopting a standard, as far as training and developing people and so forth. So we kind of have our work cut out for us, and things are only getting more complicated, with the expanded threat surface of industrial IoT devices, with the continuing threat of supply chain attacks, like we recently saw with SolarWinds. And I think as all probably know at this point, SolarWinds is not just an IT level threat. It also poses a threat at the OT level, the operational level, where things happen in the physical world, and obviously can have consequences for human health and safety there. And if you combine this with the more advanced threats that we see now in the forms of advanced persistent threat groups, that obviously have a lot of government, nation state support, the problem seems to be getting a lot worse. So I want to start with my first question. And again, we do welcome questions from the audience, but let's talk a little bit more about SolarWinds, because I think it's a good example of a lot of the challenges that we face today. The SolarWinds attack carries with it a large degree of risk to the OT sector, as I mentioned. And we recently read a report from Kaspersky that estimates that about 30% of those affected by Sunburst malware are actually in the industrial sector. And of course, their Orion Networks management application has a scanning and monitoring capability that can affect OT level devices on things like SNMP networks. A lot of those devices are used in HVAC applications. And if you want to say a couple of more words about what you do and place that into context, you're welcome to too. But I would like to start with this one big question. How can we help guard ourselves, against these more sophisticated attacks? I think that a lot of people kind of characterize as IT level attacks, but could really have a big impact at the OT level. And this is in no particular order, so feel free to jump in and we'll start the discussion.
So let me jump in. There's a lot we could say about this one attack, but I'm just going to use one word, which I use a lot because I work for a company called Trustonic, and that's trust. What really this showed is in any system, the more complicated the system, the more it matters. There are things you take for granted. There are things you focus your efforts on. And what happened with SolarWinds is people trusted that software updates were going to be secure and a good job was going to be done, and they didn't worry about it. Somebody else was solving it. And what was proved to be the case here is that SolarWinds didn't have a very good process. Somebody got in the back door, and once somebody gets in, particularly high up the food chain, we saw how broadly that problem permeated. And I'm sure many of us saw emails basically saying, are we using this software? People just didn't know. They didn't know what the impact of this would be in their organizations. And a lot of the response to SolarWinds has been, let's find out if we're impacted. Were we even using the software? If we were we vulnerable? If we were vulnerable, were we attacked? If we were attacked, what did they get? So I think you need to work out who you're going to trust and when you're going to trust them. And you also need to be prepared in case that trust proves unfounded. If you don't know what software you're using in your whole organization, if you don't have procedures in place, if that goes wrong, then you're playing catch up when it's a problem.
Yeah, I could piggyback on that as well. Not only is trust the issue, you said, are we even using this software? You know, one of the things I wanted to add, Larry, about my background is I spent 30 years with Maryland Department of Transportation. And so hence the bridges in the background. But I'm kind of a transportation guy, and we do a lot of work at Skyline Technologies with transportation partners. And when we go and look at their networks, we invariably find devices and endpoints on their network that they didn't even know they existed. And so the question, Richard asked, are we even using this software, extends to the network? Do we even know what's on our network? And we think we know, but then you have instances like this where you realize you don't quite have the complete picture you ought to have.
Joel.
Okay, so
you don't have to raise your hand.
SolarWinds. What I think SolarWinds. Pardon me.
I said you don't have to raise your hand. You can just jump in.
Okay, all right. So what SolarWinds I think teaches us at the fundamental level is that cybersecurity does not just exist within the Ethernet band, and almost all IT cybersecurity professionals focus almost, I'd say 99% of their energy and attention is in the Ethernet band. And so what we learn now when we look outside the Ethernet band and see that that's how more than 50% of successful attacks start, get their point of entry through building systems, industrial systems. That should be, for many people, an eye-opener, okay? And when we talk about trust and who do we appoint as trust, the people that can be charged with the responsibility for securing the systems that they install are often not at all involved in this process. And I believe that they should be asked to secure the systems they install, because they address to some extent the problem that John just mentioned, that a lot of companies don't even know where all their systems are. They don't really know where every camera is, where every DVR is, where every pump is located. Now, eventually they're going to have to, and it's going to be part of the process. But right now, it's those suppliers of building systems. And I won't get into the rest of the topic on them because we could go on for a while. We'll let that come up as questions. But I do think that looking outside the Ethernet band is a good place to start for the many of the people who are audience members here.
Going back to the trust issue, we always talk about zero trust in cybersecurity, and that's great, but it's also a big undertaking. You have to eventually have some trust in some vendors to where you don't have the time to analyze every firmware and software update of a vendor that you do business with a lot. I mean, in an ideal setting, yes, we can and spend that time, but even if you did, there's certain things that you may even miss in patches that you push to your devices. It's a big ask for any municipality or any building owner to try to do that on their own, or ask their small IT or small security team to do. A lot of times it's cumbersome. I mean, Most of the time it is. So where do we go? I mean, there's a lot of people that use SolarWinds, and the reason they were using SolarWinds was to try to find out what is in their network and monitor the devices in their network. So that right there says the attackers knew people who are using SolarWinds are actively monitoring a lot in their network already. So it was a good target because they knew they could hit a lot of people. A lot of people use SolarWinds and Orion for decades. So it's a problem that we're going to have to continually address. Cybersecurity and threats and attacks aren't going to go away. But I'll tell you, in 2020 compared to 2019, the amount of breaches that happened actually came down, even though the severity and maybe the ransomware amounts went up. So that shows that companies and municipalities are implementing more, and it is making a gradual effort to secure these networks more to avoid more threats.
So I want to come in from just a slightly different angle. For those of you that don't know, primarily in the United States, there's 87 billion square feet of commercial real estate. That's mostly where I play. I work with a lot of commercial real estate groups. And one of the things that we're all saying here is asset management. None of them are doing anything really from a standpoint of really doing good asset management, meaning they don't know what is connected. Let me give you an example. There was a assessment we did on one particular location. The vendor was in there, really nice guy, very helpful. And when we were going to do a review the network, he said, well, I only got 4 devices on this network. And I said, well, we have to verify that. And so we did. We hooked up and there were 32 devices on the network. He was in shock. And he said, where did all these come from? I said, I don't know. And I said, but the one you need to worry about is this Raspberry Pi that I found. It took them 2 weeks to find that Raspberry Pi and nobody knew why it was there. And if you think back, and this, when we did this just a few months before, the Jet Propulsion Lab had gotten hit where somebody had stuck a Raspberry Pi on there and nobody knew anything about it. And so they exfiltrated about, I think it was a half a gig worth of drawings from there. So, you know, SolarWinds and everything else, if you take all of those factors, the first thing foundationally is we need to all begin to get a better handle on our assets and know what we have, know where it is. And one last thing, and then I'll hush. The IT guys, and I'm not picking, this is not to pick on them, but the reality is they have 4 operating systems. They have just a few variances of firmware and that kind of thing. In our world, there's hundreds. So what it's going to require is you got to contractually work with your vendors to say, look, we need you to be responsible for this. And we need to hold you, you know, you need to let us know what we need to do to keep these things safe. Because quite frankly, your facility guys can't know all of it. So it's a lot of work, but it can be done.
Fred, I really do commend your reference to using the contract with your vendors as implementing a standard of security for the vendors. I think that is the solution for the foreseeable future, I believe.
Let me pick up on a point Anthony made, which is, you know, let's talk a little bit about what zero trust is and what it isn't, because it is it's a technical possibility, which is helpful. And one of the things that you always get in IT is you get trends and people, you know, we used to think about the inside and the outside. So the good guys are on the inside, the bad guys are on the outside, and as long as there's no connections, then we're all great. And maybe we put a firewall in because somebody's got to come in occasionally. And that was good, but we're not in Kansas anymore. It's been a long time since that's the case.
Said the Brit.
Oh, absolutely. I'm definitely not in Kansas. So I work a lot in the auto industry, and in the auto industry, traditionally and still for the most part, the network inside a car is not secure. And it never used to be a problem. But what's changing is the number of different devices put on, the number of different reasons for having that network. Things like wireless tire pressure sensors, things like easily accessible ports like reversing cameras, means that now people can get onto that network. It's no longer treated as somewhere secure. Same's true in all of our IT systems and our OT systems. If we've been using proper untrusted networks, which is what zero trust is all about, so that you need to know who you're communicating with, you need to protect messages going between point A and point B, then it wouldn't have mattered that SolarWinds got inside, because they wouldn't be able to attack anything, because they wouldn't see the visibility. So there are solutions like VPNs, which can help a little bit, but they can give you a false sense of security if you don't know what your assets are. It all comes back to understand your estate, find your solutions. And in the long term, things like zero trust, yeah, they probably are the answer, but they're going to take a long time to roll forward and to get those universally used.
Yeah,
I agree.
let's talk just a second about the people issue. I've been known to talk about people, process, and technology, and the people side of this is huge, because what happens in the transportation world, which I'm familiar with, physical infrastructure transportation side, is you've got different divisions who have different business needs, who put devices in the field, usually without the left hand knowing what the right's doing. So the traffic signals division drops a communication line into a traffic signal, and then the traffic operations division drops in a video camera for traffic monitoring, and then the goes on and on. Construction division comes through the project and runs fiber through there, and before you know it, you've got half a dozen devices communicating off of different networks with not a lot of different standards in play, as was mentioned. And so, I think we fundamentally agree with, zero trust. We fundamentally agree with managing your assets better, but practically speaking, from a people and a process standpoint, it's really hard because you got so many players and so many people in the kitchen.
Yeah, and there's so many protocols that don't play nice together. So where you've got protocols that play nice and don't steal bandwidth from each other, then yeah, you don't need to know that somebody else down the corridor is doing something else.
Right.
But as Joel said, a lot of these things are not running on the Ethernet. They're running on proprietary protocols. They conflict with each other, and you need to plan.
So along that lines, the people line, in the past year and a half, we've seen a 600% increase in ransomware attacks on the front end. Now, let's just for a moment think about, or let me try to convey the way that we see it every time we walk into a building. Is there is a application server sitting there that's running in this building, and it's on the engineer's desk, and he sits down there and he checks his email. Would you do that on a SharePoint server?
Mm-hmm.
No. IT would have a cow. But see, the thing is this all comes back to culture. This is 20 years of culture. I've been in this for 20 years, and that's the way it always has been. You put the application server on the engineer's desk. Oh, well, you can just use this to check the internet or whatever the case may be. We got to shift. We got to start thinking of these things as actual application servers. They need to be taken off, put in a closet somewhere, and you use a workstation to access them. But the thing is 80% of the overall attacks that we've seen have been ransomware, and 100% of them were avoidable, and 100% of them were recoverable had they been doing backups. But in some cases, no backups are done, or the backup is backed up right to the application server, which gets ransomed.
Yeah.
So it's a culture. There's you got to change the people.
And Fred, to hit your point about the buildings and all the vendor and suppliers and manufacturers that deal with individual buildings, how many of them have you seen that have unmonitored access into the networks?
Almost 100%.
Yeah, and that's one of the major problems is these vendors are getting unmonitored access, sometimes 24/7 access to the network. And those are big holes and big tunnels that are open for potential attacks. And this is where we talk about zero trust, but it's not even zero trust. You just have to start building in security where you have monitored, timed access, because these vendors don't need 24/7 access to your networks.
And that goes back
No.
30 years or more. I remember mini computers where the vendor had remote access to the servers even after the customer bought it with a default password, so they could get in and fix anything.
Sure.
So it's a culture which needs a lot of fixing. One thing I always advocate, which may seem a little odd, is have a public Wi-Fi. Because if you don't, people will plug things into network ports where they have no business plugging things in. Make sure that when somebody visits, they can read their own email without compromising your systems.
So Fred, I'd like to connect your comment before with using contracts with your comment just a second ago about the culture. And there's the simple process of having a cybersecurity hygiene for the suppliers of building systems that they comply with, making that an addendum to a contract, and and acceptance of that contract depends on them applying that hygiene. And the hygiene would include exactly what you said: separate server for a user account and for a system administrator account, and and only as many rights as they need at that local. And I believe that's the way to address that problem. It's not even a technical solution.
No.
It's like, John, it's just the people process thing.
So along that lines, I mean, what we're seeing is the commercial real estate people that we're working with are beginning to incorporate, basically, you can't work with us if you don't comply. So what happens is they have you can't come in the door and dump 1,000 policy items on somebody because it just won't work. But you can layer in some really good foundational stuff, and then periodic compliance checks with your vendor. And if your vendor is not complying, then he goes into a warning phase. And then if they continue to not comply, then they are no longer a vendor. So,
right. And
So
that's
what
where
are some of the
purchasing,
things that
procurement
the
can play a big role in this, in the approved vendor list.
right?
Make it
Do you
very
guys have any?
administrative.
Do you guys have any practical advice on what our end user clients and owner operators who are attending this can do to put into their specification or their selection criteria? Should they reference certain standards? How can the end users do this in a way that's manageable? Because I don't think anybody's in a position to come up with an exhaustive list of criteria, like you said, about how a third party should incorporate and practice good cybersecurity.
Okay, so
we know this was a problem at SolarWinds because from what I've read, they sort of deliberately de-invested in cybersecurity in order to boost their bottom line. So obviously this is something that our customers want to avoid. So how can they where do they get started to even do that?
Yeah, so a couple things. Just like we said, you have to start looking outside of Ethernet. You can't start looking for a standard. It was only a year and a half ago that NIST came out and said, sorry, folks, we can't create a standard for IoT devices and building systems. There are 50 configurations, and there are about 50 considerations that have to be made. So the whole question of standard is, it's the wrong tree to bark up at this time.
I would say it is now, but I come
now. Right.
From some other industries. If you look at automotive, it's radically changing in the last couple of years, the last few years. Yeah. So I think it's going to happen, but today it's not there for automotive.
So what do? So you give and you can't boil the ocean by training every building systems vendor on cybersecurity, and they have a cybersecurity expert. That's never going to work. So what we can do is provide the service of saying these 25 controls should be put in place by your video surveillance provider for your particular building. And then spend only a few hours with that building system supplier to explain why and when they need to do the controls. There are almost none of these that require training in actually how to do the control. They all know how to, I won't go into examples of it. They all know how to do this stuff. They just don't know why, and they don't know when, because they don't have a security framework, a security mentality, security expertise. They don't even understand. Most of them have very little understanding of the network architecture. So a prescriptive approach is a perfectly good approach.
And so when we're
Perfectly
trying
good.
to get end users, what advice can we give them? There's a lot that we talk about here, but there's even much more that we haven't even touched upon yet. So how do we relay this information concisely and quickly? I would tell end users to reach out to experts in the industry like ourselves here on this panel, and there's others out there. And the purpose is to have guidance. And Fred mentioned this earlier, and we do it a lot at Integrated Network Concepts. We do network and security assessments and audits. We understand everything that's in the network, wired and wireless, and we go over that with our clients. And then every time, there hasn't been one that either things aren't showing up or devices that they had no idea are showing up.
Mhm.
So every client believes that they know everything that's in their network, but these assessments and audits are a great place to start. It will give you a baseline of what's connected and what you need to look into. And as far as security policy,
Okay, first point of controversy for our conversation. In the building system space, I actually don't think that an initial assessment is the best approach for most end users. I believe that there are 14, 15, 30 security controls that everybody needs to put in place. It's just, it's universal. So if you just start with that prescriptive approach and you start doing that, you're going to educate not only the buyer, but also the building system supplier. And along the way, well, one more thing, I know it's controversial, I know. Along the way, they will say, they will find that Raspberry Pi, they will find these other things. And so it's a efficient way of making progress and then doing a formal assessment later. And because then that assessment is smaller and less expensive, because you've already learned where a lot of stuff is, you've already documented a lot of stuff along the way. I know, I see. For
I guess
pragmatism
might
and
have
for
some
money, for
responses to
budget
that.
costs, that's what I recommend. All right, go for it.
All right. So I'm not going to disagree with what you said. Those are very, very valid points. But I kind of go back to what the very first thing in the NIST cybersecurity framework is identify. And you have to know what you have in order to protect it. And you do have to have those basic best practices. But I can tell you successfully for the past couple of years, we've done them in concert most of the time, is that we're able to go in, do assessments, even remotely, do an assessment on the network, do an assessment on the vendors, and then layer in a best practices that fit for that organization, because one organization may be mature at this level and another one may be mature at this level. And so you want to make sure that you don't overload that guy that's down here, but you also want to make sure that you meet the guy that's up here. So I'm a firm believer in identifying what you got first.
John?
Well, let me, this is a little like arguing which came first, the chicken or the egg.
Right.
I think they're
Right, it's
both
the grand
they're both
conundrum.
good ideas, and you probably got to work both ends to the middle. But let me take a different slice at the problem, in the sense that this is good cybersecurity is a shared responsibility, and as such, the owner, you can't have great security if the architecture of your system stinks to begin with. So the owner of the network has to take certain steps to make sure that their network is designed soundly. To Fred's point earlier, you don't have applications running on the same server and a system that you're accessing the internet, accessing email. So you have to, the building owner and the owner of the network has a responsibility to architect it well, architect it soundly. But then we need to leverage, as Joel said, the contracts we have with vendors to make sure that they understand the rules on how they play in that network. And we don't probably convey that well enough in our contractual vehicles. So, you kind of have to come at this from several different angles. The network owner's responsibility for a sound infrastructure and how it's designed and architected and segmented and so forth. Then you need to have good contractual mechanisms to make clear what the expectation from the vendor is on there. So it's a shared responsibility. And I want to get to the question actually that's in the Q&A, but the question is, can you run smart city operations over the public internet? I think the answer is a qualified yes, depending upon how it's architected. If it's architected well and it's segmented well and you've got encryption in place and some things like that, the answer could be yes. But people don't always design their systems that way. So anyway, there's a responsibility here for the network owner as well as the contractor vendor.
I will agree with that and push it up a level.
Mm-hmm.
Who in your organization is responsible for making this secure? It should probably be an exec, because if it's not secure and you get a major outage, ransomware, whatever, think of what the impact is on your organization or business. And is somebody of appropriate level of seniority responsible for that? Because you can go fire the guy who's trying to make things work on no budget, but it's not going to make you feel any better and it's not going to solve the problem.
Yeah.
So you
is
need
that the CISO?
Yeah. You need somebody of appropriate seniority who has the budget, remit, and ability to solve this. And then he can go and find the experts. He can go and go through the things we're talking about. But if you're stuck in a little network booth trying to solve everything with no budget, no responsibility, you're not going to be talking to us, and you're not going to be solving the problem.
So I'll give a little experience over the past few years where I've helped CISOs communicate, because they're never usually at the same level as the other C-suite execs, as far as the CEO and the CFO. And the reason I bring this up is the CFO is usually controlling the money and looks at cybersecurity as a liability. And the less we spend on it, the more profitable we'll be. We throw more money at cybersecurity, we get no return. And that's why CISOs and CIOs are fighting for budgets to try to implement more security, but they don't know how to relate it in financial terms. So what I've done over the years is I have proprietary calculators I formed that calculate the cost of downtime. So a CFO, when I talked with the C-suite and asked them, do you know how much it costs your company or your city for an hour of downtime or a day? 95% of them have no clue. The other 5% usually throw out a number that's way off. But then once we run through a little workshop or a little experiment calculating downtime, they're blown away. And a lot of times they'll instantly say, hey, they'll talk to the CIO or the CISO and say, if you need this and this will help us avoid, potentially 10 hours of downtime a year, yes, I'll increase your budget and so forth. So there's always that. Speaking in cybersecurity or too technical to relate that in layman's terms to other C-suite executives, so they understand that the impact that we're investing in cybersecurity to prevent downtime, to make sure our customers can still communicate, purchase, and buy from us, and so that we're not losing out to competitors. There's a lot of things that need to be in talks to get the other C-suite executives to give more budget for cybersecurity.
Absolutely agree. And I think it's the one thing that's good from SolarWinds is it showed that you don't have to be targeted yourself. The number of companies I talk to say, well, we're not going to be, we're not the big guys, we're not going to be targeted. But these sort of horizontal attacks hit everybody. And so, nobody should be complacent.
Yeah, a true example of a supply chain attack there, SolarWinds, and this is the big thing that I think customers have to worry about right now. But it's not the first one we've seen. I mean, the Target hack, what was that, 2013, I think? So that was where a third party, who was contracted by Target to monitor HVAC systems was compromised, and the attacker got in through their connection to Target's network and exposure of right? Millions of credit card records and so forth. So that's another big risk. And I think the supply chain attacks are going to be one of the major concerns. I think a lot of people spend a lot of time talking about ransomware this year, and it's certainly a big threat, but supply chain attacks, to me, what we've seen with SolarWinds could be far more wide ranging. And yeah, you're not the primary target. You don't have to be. They can get to you through other means.
I believe that the supply chain attacks are not essentially financially motivated, whereas the ransomware attacks are almost 100% financially motivated. So they're really coming from two different sources for two different purposes, two different cultural bases, and we have to defend our systems. But I think that their life cycle is, they have to be treated differently.
Yeah, the problem is they're getting combined. I mean, I see this a lot because I work with mobile phones and mobile operators and mobile application developers. And literally, I can go to a website, download a ransomware kit, change the target address that I want to go, rebrand it as somebody else's app, and ship it up. And there's a how-to YouTube video telling me what to do.
And customer support.
Easy now. Customer support. It's so easy now. These are not sophisticated. We always say sophisticated targeted attack. Really what we mean is teenager who can download stuff from the internet too often. And that's a challenge. So we're seeing around the world, you'll get somebody in Peru attacking their local convenience store. We'll get somebody in Malaysia attacking something else there, and so on, because the attackers are local. So who is a big target for them isn't who we might think. We go and look at the Silicon Valley giants and assume they're going to be the ones attacked. But unfortunately, it's been democratized and attacks are happening everywhere. So yeah, it's a scary time. Today, there's many more attacks on mobile systems and on desktop systems and on web browsers. But one thing that I've seen an awful lot of is there's so much more growth in people, this large community learning about IoT, learning about using Raspberry Pis, learning about building little systems with a camera on them. And of course, that opens their targets up. They can go and stick one of those, into the shop that they work and access the network and skim things off. There's so many options now that it's really not a time to be complacent.
So here's a topic that we've never discussed as a group before, Richard, coming from your comment right there. We've already identified that the OT network has a lot more firmware download events taking place, a lot more devices, a lot more events. Yet are any of us aware of any product that will enable a building system supplier to protect their customer from compromised downloaded firmware? Do we know of any?
I do know of one, and they presented last week. It's a company called Adolis, and they keep sort of a register of verified, trusted software updates and patches that you could match against any patch or update that's being pushed out to you to verify.
Is that Adolis? A-D-O-L-I-S?
A-D-O-L-U-S, yeah.
U-S?
So
and
this is kind of
There's Eclipsum. There's a second one. But so these are just now coming
just
on.
Now. Yeah, this
board.
is a nascent market, yeah.
And that theoretically, with some maturity in that area, we're going to be able to eliminate, compromised downward. Go ahead, Richard.
I was going to say, it's interesting. 5 years ago, people didn't upgrade firmware. You'd buy a system and you'd put it in, and most of the time it would never get upgraded. And because of the issues with people using open source TCP stacks with vulnerabilities and all of these things, the big push from the big manufacturers, from the chip vendors, from the compiler writers and everyone else is you must have upgradable firmware. So we're getting this double. The really old devices are not that, at least stable, if not secure. And now we're in this stage where people are trying to upgrade everything, but they don't really have the processes in place to do it securely. And yeah, we haven't quite got to that new world where there are good processes in place to check that firmware upgrade is only good. I mean, when I was involved in an enterprise product a way back, which probably had 10, 100 million users. It was a reasonable size. And we debated, this was many years ago, we debated endlessly over whether to do software updates at all.
Right.
Because we knew if we got it wrong,
Right.
Bang, that's our business dead.
Right. So we'd always stay 1 or 2 versions behind, right? On the downloads.
So
but
our
then
customers,
with WannaCry, they attacked old version. So then it became best practice to download right away everything and even put it on automatic download.
Yeah.
So now they're compromised. So I don't think we can rely on the vendor to do it, the manufacturer, to secure their own website, because we're dependent on it and our customers are dependent on it. So I believe that building system suppliers need tools that enable them and empower them to be able to be responsible for the 15 products that they supply, install, service, and protect.
It's really
what do you
difficult.
think about that?
It's really difficult because I agree more people having control is good. But if I'm, so I was working with a vendor that does smart speakers, and they encrypt their firmware for good reason. There's good IP in there, and so how is anyone else ever going to know whether that's a secure update or not? All they can do is check that it came from that manufacturer, even if they had the ability to analyze the code, which of course none of us do in the real world. So there is always that level of trust,
okay. So let's say that the building system supplier had an encrypted connection to the supplier with a key, and so they got the authorized version, and now it was their job to, they knew what they had the version, they had the correct version. It was not compromised. Now it's their job to protect it.
So that's protecting the transit, and you're relying on the manufacturer putting the right software on their server, which is exactly what went wrong with the attack we all started with.
With SolarWinds, right?
With SolarWinds. Yes, it all helps. There is no magic bullet.
No,
Well,
there's not.
it
There's many
is
things
this
that need to be done.
issue of multiple layers of defense, right?
Absolutely.
That's all. I mean, that's really the only strategy that works.
Anthony, you were going to say something?
Yeah, the SolarWinds wasn't about getting the authenticated right version of a software firmware update from SolarWinds. It was within the firmware itself that SolarWinds had. So even if you have a VPN and it's encrypted,
there you go. Yeah, that's true. That's true.
That's all I was going to bring up.
So what happens in automotive and in the mobile space, I mean, like mobile phone manufacturers, is they have some very tight processes because they understand the risks, and those industries have matured much more than building systems have. So they always have hardware security modules for signing software. They always have encryption keys and validated endpoints and a chain of trust. Now, obviously, if you put garbage in at one end, you're going to still get garbage out the other end, but you are putting more control in place. And those industries are much more mature. There are standards and expectations. If you want to launch a handset which claims to be Android with a capital A, Google will make you jump through a set of hoops to prove that you've done a good job. There isn't the equivalent in the industries that we're talking about today. But I think that's what you have to get to. Whether they are true NIST or industry standards, or whether they're manufacturer standards, we need something. Because without that, you're relying on everybody saying, sure, I haven't cut my budget for cybersecurity, I've done a good job. And you as a customer have to trust them or have a contract where they're liable when things go wrong.
So it should be in the SLA or whatever you have with your supplier to hold them accountable. Fred, was that you? I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, that's fine. So listening to everything, if I can, I kind of want to go back to the pure building side of this conversation. Is, there is work going on now to create some secure protocols and that kind of thing for building systems. However, and I keep harping on, there's 87 billion square feet of buildings out there with control systems in them that are legacy. Well, whatever they're doing today is a good solution 5-10 years down the road. We got to do something with all of this. So going back and putting my integrator hat on, what I used to do before this, I was the vendor. I was the guy that installed, built, designed these systems that go in your building. And what happened is the industry as a whole wanted to get to open protocols, which BACnet is like prolific across my world. BACnet requires no username and password. I can take you right now and show you how I can get into most any system without a username and password. And the reason is they wanted to be able to talk across various manufacturers, right? So we have these totally open systems that are put in by someone like myself, the company I used to work for, not picking on them, but let's just say one of you are the building owner and you come to me and you give me a set of mechanicals, a sequence of operation, a riser diagram. And you say, I want you to put a Johnson control system in, or I want you to put a tritium system in. That's all the guidance I got. So going back to, I think Joel said earlier, or maybe it was John, is the whole thing about ownership. Everybody's got to take their part of the ownership. And so if I'm the building owner and I have a system inside of there, I have to come up with what I'm going to tell that vendor you have to do in order to meet my criteria, in order to do business with me. And that's that we are seeing that trend happening. So if you have an existing system in there, if they're running a single username and password for all the vendors, a single username and password for all the facility guys, change it. If you've got a public IP in your application server, get it off of there. If you have the server sitting there where anybody can get to it, lock it up. And though, dude, I mean, we're talking about almost no cost solutions. And it's there's a lot of low hanging fruit, I guess is what I'm saying.
A lot of low hanging fruit.
That's my point on the hygienes, and just take care of that stuff right off, and you're already making progress. But I have a specific question for you in regard to BACnet. Since it's an environment, it's a product I think we can focus on a little bit. Have you seen any difference with the, have you had any experience with the Secure Connect version of BACnet yet?
Yes, I have. And here's another, I'm probably going to get hit for this. There's another problem with it. It's great. I'm not knocking it. But I remember sitting through one of their demos and everything, and I listened and everything. When it got finished, I said, does it have to have a managed switch? And they said, well, absolutely. And I said, okay, well, 80-90% of the networks that I have that we're taking care of are running Best Buy switches, unmanaged. So what you're saying is they're going to have to rip out their network and put in a new one. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but what I'm saying is most of these guys, when you tell them, hey, I'm coming in, I'm going to re-IP everything, the building engineer goes, what are you going to, what? Because he's got sequences of operations and everything, and you're going to screw up his world. He's not happy.
Right.
So there's a resistiveness to changing the network. Like I say, I'm not saying you shouldn't, but there are constraints that secure BACnet has to work in.
You simply can't. I mean, yeah, those are operational requirements, and you simply cannot do that. John, you want to make a comment, please?
I've done, when I was at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab, we took an approach. One of the hats I wore early on in my career is I was the Public Safety Communications Interoperability Director, which is like the world's longest title. But basically what I had to worry about was, could public safety agencies talk to one another? So that would be not only share data across systems, but also voice communication. So we kind of came across an architectural approach that I think has served me well over the years. And it's basically kind of throwing your hands up and saying, look, the data layer, these basic legacy fundamental systems were never really designed to be accessed from outside, from the internet. They were never really designed to serve data up to third parties in the cloud or over the internet. And so they are what they are, and short of rip and replace, which is really not a viable option in a lot of cases, right. You got to do something else. The other thing that I think is a mega trend you see is that's the data layer. Imagine also at the top, the presentation layer. Increasingly, everybody wants to get it wirelessly, mobile, and on their smartphone. You know, whether that's a good idea or not, it doesn't really matter. Everybody wants it on a tablet or a smartphone. So you kind of like bookends. You've got a data layer that is what it is. You've got a presentation layer where the data has to go that everybody wants, that has certain constraints in bandwidth and form factor. the only practical solution is to build an integration layer in the middle that does the translation and the heavy lift between those two communities. And if you do it in that fashion, you can preserve the legacy data system in some fashion, and you provide some gates at the integration layer that increases security, and you can standardize it and take these million operating systems and serve it up to the presentation layer in something that's more consumable. So I just say that, you know, this goes back to the building owner's responsibility or the network owner's responsibility to architect, at least at a high level, how all this stuff should chunk together. And in my experience, leveraging an integration layer for greater security is a piece of that.
No, I think that's a good idea. And I think that's what a lot of end users are doing by adopting these kind of IoT based systems, is they have the ability to sort of serve as that common layer of abstraction, you know, from all this different data coming in from all these legacy systems. And I think the legacy system market, or installed base, I should say, is going to really continue to be a challenge, because these systems don't get replaced for 20 years or 30 years. And you know, the new technology is great, but like you said, you're not going to get somebody to rip this stuff out. There has to be a really compelling value proposition behind ripping that stuff out. And when it is ripped out, it's not done all at once. It's a lot of times typically done in phased migrations, where maybe you're going to, you know, upgrade your HMI, but you don't want to upgrade, you know, the controls that are down in the basement kind of thing until you absolutely have to. So I'm afraid the installed base is something that we're probably going to have to live with, you know, for another 20 years before everybody kind of catches up.
I don't even think it's necessary to rip it out. So I have two things I want to bring up here. One is I just published an article in a BACnet journal on how to secure building systems in a BACnet SC environment. And it addresses some of these issues. But I believe that securing the communications, encrypting the communications inside the OT network can be done in today's world now with the last, you know, some new technology, can be done relatively inexpensively, relatively without any involvement of IT by OT people. And then use the contract and the hygiene with the building system suppliers to secure the outside of the OT network, and to do whatever physical security is required on the devices that attach to the IoT devices, and so that you minimize that, and you've essentially secured the environment.
Yeah.
Now,
So
go ahead.
It comes back to the idea of zero trust. And zero trust is a great model when you've got a new, fresh network. But if you've got an old legacy system like a BACnet system, which is not secure, you need to isolate it. You need to say it's either its own physical, and I'm not going to put anything else on that network because it's not secure, or you tunnel parts of that network across each other using technologies like VPNs. So you can say, I don't, you know, nothing bad's going to happen between these different areas.
Right.
But you can't fix it. And the biggest mistake that's easy to make is to say, well, I've already got a network connection there. I'll stick something else on it because it's convenient and it saves me running some extra wire. And you've got to treat this stuff as, yeah, this is what it is. It's going to be there for 20 years, but logically isolate it and isolate it in the architecture so that it can't infect anything else and vice versa, or you've got trouble.
So Fred mentioned something I wanted to bring up that highlights the elephant in the room, where yes, if an integrator or cybersecurity engineer comes in and wants to put in a managed switch, the IT engineers in dealing with facility managers and the OT technicians, there's a big gap, and one side doesn't understand what the other side deals with, and vice versa. So when they're proposing a more secure managed switch, they don't know how that impacts the OT and the technician's daily job and all the sequencing that they have with their HVAC and all their control networks of HVAC and the boilers and chillers in the building and so forth. So there has to be, I believe, to make this easier, and I think Joel hit a little bit on this, to where there are certain things that the OT guys can do that could help secure their system, BACnet, LAN, Modbus, and everything that they're working with, without getting too IT technical, they can help. But also, if we could get IT and OT to play together and start understanding each other's environments, that will really help push forward security in buildings. And that's my point of view, and that's my opinion.
Agree.
But we
You know,
have to be able to proceed. I think we have to proceed without a lot of involvement from IT. They're not, we have to, a lot of them, I mean, I'm in an organization with 100 CIOs. They're not particularly interested.
but
They got
you know,
enough on their plate.
Well,
And I-
that's something that we've talked about in the forum last week when we had our cybersecurity track, is this kind of convergence of IT and OT cybersecurity organizations. A lot of this IT type of technology has made its way down to the OT level. What can we do to get them interested? I mean, it seems to me that there's some kind of collaboration that's needed between these two domains. There's no such thing as purely an IT level attack or purely an OT level attack. John, do you want to jump in on that?
Well, what I suggest that, the news that is helpful is the ability to have some cost savings. What I've found is that if you pay attention to the network and you architect it well, there are usually some savings to be found in there, not to mention in terms of opportunity costs or cost avoidance, but also in actual costs. I mean, in the transportation world, when you got a bunch of OT devices in the field and you're running comms to all of them, if you could just consolidate communications across those devices, there's savings to be had there. So optimizing your network can find some savings and bring the OT and the IT world a little bit together, and that might speak to the C-suite.
John, I have a question that you could maybe answer. How often have you seen that there are network diagrams and visuals that you can actually talk with other departments and plan this out?
Yeah, no, this is a big piece of our work at Skyline, as a matter of fact, because it's so funny because transportation agencies, again, are really big on, quote, as-built drawings. So, if you get that bridge, you want the as-built drawings of that bridge, of how they modified it during construction.
Exactly.
If they were only as diligent about their communications and network infrastructure, we probably wouldn't be having this conversation. So agencies have to begin to see their networks and the architecture of those networks as a strategic asset that has to be managed as strongly as they manufacture, as they manage their production processes, their construction processes, and everything else. And for years, that hasn't been the case.
So one last point on this is that cities, a lot of times they have so many different departments, and a lot of times they have no idea how far their network extends, what's added in certain areas of their network, and they don't have these visuals. They don't have network diagrams that are within the last 2 years, some not within the last 5. So those alone provide valuable information that can help on planning and designing.
Mm-hmm. I agree with all of that. And I think a lot of this comes down to, again, modern trends, separating the physical network from the virtual network. You can run VPNs, you can run different 5G channels. There's lots of, generally speaking, not always, but generally speaking, bandwidth isn't an issue these days. So yeah, you can, as long as you isolate these different networks from each other at the logical level so that they can't interact badly, then yeah, there's a lot of cost savings in terms of just reusing of cable. An awful lot of the move to people using 5G is simply save the cost of putting cables down. We saw the same thing in automotive. It used to be you bought a car, there was a huge wiring loom, and there was wires running to every part of the car. And when you pushed the switch to lower the window, if you had a nice posh car with it, you didn't have to do the windy thing. When you push the switch to lower the window, there was a cable connecting that to a motor in the door, which would then lower it. That's not how it works today. It's not how it's worked for years. These are now 2 microprocessors on a bus because it saves in wiring costs. And just as it saves in wiring cost in a car, you can do the same thing in a building. But as we've been saying, if you just throw everything on one network without isolating the different parts of it, then you're going to have problems.
Richard, let's talk about 5G for a second, because you mentioned it. We haven't gone much into it.
We went for an hour without mentioning 5G. I thought that's got to be a first, and I need to talk about it.
Yeah, it is on our list, and I want to talk about 5G because we see it as really starting to build a lot of momentum this year, and especially into next year in smart city applications for a wide variety of applications. From electric vehicles or autonomous vehicles to just about everything, really. And that's going to mean a lot more sensors deployed out there. In the meantime, it doesn't seem like, while 5G has some kind of built-in security features and things like that, it doesn't really seem like these are appropriate for, sort of mission critical environments. So what should we be looking for, when it comes to cybersecurity with 5G as we're implementing all these millions of new sensors and systems that are out there? Anybody care to comment on that?
I would say there's a lot to 5G. It's a very complicated subject, but you can look at it in two different ways, and neither of them's quite right. One way is just to say it's a fatter pipe. Great. So it's a better connectivity than I had before. Superb. So it's faster, it's got more bandwidth, you have more devices. But the other part of 5G is that you can have isolated zones, a little bit like having VPNs, where you can have a private network which is isolated from other people's network. And I mean, I was talking about quality of service when I was doing my PhD quite a long time ago, and it's still the quality of service argument. But for this discussion, it's really about the isolation for security. The idea that in a city, and even more in a factory or in a building, you can say, I need a network which is just for application X. No one else is on that network. It's completely isolated. And it's like running physical cable, but without the need to do it. And 5G makes a lot of that easier, but it's nothing fundamentally different about it than with other technologies. It's just something where it sort of comes for free.
I would add that we need to become more comfortable in a multi-transport world, because from a public safety standpoint, where I've done a lot of my work, it used to be land mobile radio, and you had your radio and you had dispatch, and that was it. Well, you look at the modern day police car, to put it in Richard's world, it's got wireless devices, it's got a Wi-Fi bubble around the car potentially, it's got dash video cameras, body video cameras, it's got fixed cameras on the roadside. I mean, you're going to be using Wi-Fi, you're going to be using Bluetooth, you're going to be using 5G, you're going to be using all sorts of communications paths. And we don't have personnel in certainly public safety agencies, if not other agencies, that are that conversant in this diverse a wireless transport network. So you have to get smarter on that front as well. And we aren't as smart as we need to be in that world.
Yeah, I think that the future answer is back to the idea of zero trust. Is my endpoint's got a key, the thing I'm talking to's got a key. We don't care how we're connected, because whatever happens, that key's securing us. Mm-hmm. And for new systems, that's great. But we're not in the world of new systems. We've got to deal with so many existing systems. So we need to use a combination of all of these technologies out there.
Right, which is why I argue for an integration layer which referees between those disparate systems and so forth. It's a lot how we architect our video systems in the Skyline world is to have separate servers that are talking to different networks, so you can isolate them, as you've suggested. Does the translation between all the proprietary video formats so that you can consume it with H.264 in the presentation layer and open it with a browser. I mean, those are the kind of techniques you use. And before I leave this subject, the document that I'm kind of quoting from with the 3 layers, it's going to be published by CISA in the next month. So if you keep your eye out, you'll see this a publication on information sharing framework, because there's this tension between wanting to share information and having access, and then locking it down and making it secure and encrypting it all. And so you have to balance these two things, and it's not an easy thing. And this information sharing framework will be published by CISA this month. So look for it.
And for those of our people that are listening that don't know who CISA is, that is the Critical Infrastructure Security Agency. which is part of DHS that, largely looks at cybersecurity when it comes to critical infrastructure. I think it's CISA.gov, CISA.gov, if you want to find out more about that. Does anybody else have a comment on 5G? No, everybody's going to remain silent on 5G.
I don't think there's any real controversy. Richard handled it perfectly. It's good.
Yeah, I thought that was a great response. Let's go back to people again, because it seems like so we've talked a lot about technology. We haven't talked a lot about how do we develop people, right, in these organizations. I think, Joel, specifically at the OT level, there's not a lot of people, I don't think, that are walking around with GICSP certifications or a deep level of training in OT level cybersecurity. What are some of the things that we could do to make people more aware? Everything from implementing basic cybersecurity awareness programs to, maybe more advanced training. What can we do to train people up?
Well, I believe really that training is like you've identified a solution, which I'm not certain is the right one. It's more prescription based. It's just kind of give them guidance,
Okay.
coaching, prescription, oversight.
This has been a tough subject to sell to a lot of people in the smart cities marketplace, right? I started talking about cybersecurity in smart cities, I think, a little over 3 years ago. Tried to get presentations at various events, and it seemed like something that people just did not want to talk about. I don't know if you've seen the same thing. So I guess part of this is training. Part of this is how do we build awareness that this is really an important issue. And somebody mentioned driving this down from the top levels of management. So what are some of the things we can do to make people more educated and aware, aside from just sort of basic training?
I think a lot of it is about awareness and training. One of the things that we've talked about in the past as a group is how a lot of time in operational technology, somebody's come in and said, okay, your job is to do X. They learn how to do it, and that's it. That's the end of their training, because at one level, then what they're doing hasn't changed. But there's a new set of threats. There's a new set of possibilities. We're talking about the networks changing all of the time. If they are not given the responsibility and the understanding of how all of that impacts their world, they're not going to react to it. They're going to sit in a silo and just deal with it. And that's when these problems, upper management's not going to find out about them, because nobody's even aware that there's an issue going on. So I do think in any walk of life, you need champions. You need people who do their job really well, who can show others how to do better. And this is an area where there aren't very many of those people, and we need more of them.
Yeah. John?
I had a perspective when I was the interoperability director in Maryland. I used to say that interoperability is everybody's problem, therefore it's nobody's problem.
Right.
And cybersecurity is a little the same way. And it goes back to what we said at the outset, people, process, and technology. If you realize that it's not just the technology that has to factor into it. We haven't talked about response to an incident as an example.
No, that's on my list, actually. So let's talk about that. That's a good example.
How you respond to an incident means you first have to detect it. And then second, you have to have procedures and policy that says we're going to do this, 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 and this, and we're going to do it within 40 minutes or 30 minutes or something like that shuts the door before the cow has left the barn. So, you have to wrap the people issues revolving around training and trust and that piece with the process issues of how do we respond, what are our SOPs, what are our protocols, and then have technology that supports that. And until you have all three of those in alignment, you're going to be in trouble.
So when we're talking about cybersecurity related to smart cities, dealing with city officials and their departments, when they've trained or let employees get training, a lot of times they didn't realize that once they get some certifications, the private sector will gobble them up, increase their pay, and then they're left without any talent to fill in. And it's always been hard for the public sector to get good certified engineers in cybersecurity to work there because the pay just isn't there.
Mm.
But there's ways that they could offer continuing education and training with signing saying, hey, I agree, I'll take this free training that you'll pay for and stay on for 2 to 3 years, make that commitment. That way
Yeah.
you get the buy-in from your employees, and then you hold on to the talent that you're investing in. And when you do invest in your employees, you'll get better work from them because they feel valued, that you're investing in their education. And I don't know about you guys, but I'm always constantly learning. There's never been a year that I haven't taken a course or learned new technology. So, and that's how cybersecurity is. It's constantly evolving. You have to stay on top. You can't rest on your laurels. So training is key.
So
Yep.
I want to throw something out there. If we can, I mean, I know we kind of moved to the incident, but if we could step back to the people, the subject right before is I was fortunate in that I was a IT guy up until 2000. Now I don't consider myself an IT guy anymore because I hadn't done it for 21 years. But I speak the language. And then I moved into this wonderful world of control systems and I learned a whole new world. And there is a role, and I've been saying this for years, there is a role that has to be developed, and it has to be a me that knows both sides. The thing is, though, what I see time and time again is like we've hired sole IT guys, IT guys that have come in, and it's like it's literally blown their mind when they've gone into these buildings, and they're like,
Right.
what? And I was like, look, we got to go way back. We got to pull it back. So with that said, is and let me say this too. I'm also on a framework committee with buildingcybersecurity.org, working with some people right now to build a cybersecurity framework specifically for commercial real estate. But even with those guys, I'm having to say, take it back. You can't come in with NIST 853A and drop 1,682 controls on these people. So it's a layered approach. And I like to put things in terms of stories. So we're all probably old enough to remember when OSHA wasn't really a thing. Okay. I remember when I was graduated from high school, I went to work offshore. And if I was during my high school and first year in college, and if I was afraid to climb up a 200-foot tower and reach out and change a light bulb, my coworkers called me a wimp, right? Fast forward to the last company I worked for was a mechanical engineering firm. If you did something like that there, they'd turn you in. Why? Because OSHA came in phases. And that's how we're going to have to do this. We have to train people that are more mechanically inclined because they have to understand that system. They have to understand how that system works. And then they need to learn some IT side to be able to work with the IT guys. Just my opinion, but I think that's what we got to do.
I don't think, I see it in other industries as well. It's a very common problem. I mean, I was working with a silicon manufacturer. So they build chips, and they've got some of our software on there. And they were saying they sell those chips. They go into control systems, they go into vehicles, they go into building control systems, very broadly used. And they say they've got two types of customer. They've got the computer science majors who understand how to write the programs, and to them the hardware is a big switch that they turn on and off at some, by some magic. But that's about half of their customers. The other half are the other way around. They are the hardware guys. And to them, the program is just something that they've got to prod occasionally to make it actuate the right thing. Completely different way of looking at it. True. And of course, they don't, security to them is just not something they're doing. They are saying, which bit of Python or whatever do I need to stick on this machine so that when the temperature goes above 20 degrees, that actuator gets pushed. And they put something in, done, finished, never look at it again. And there are always these two different worlds. And if you never bridge them, then we're going to hit these problems with security. So yeah, a lot of it's training, a lot of it's getting people to talk to each other. It's not unique in this world.
Yeah. So the way I think we have to approach it as a group, the us's, there's short term and there's long term. short term, we need to provide a pragmatic solution, prescriptive solution to do what we can do now. At the same time is a long-term thing where we do the education, the training, and the grooming, and the cultural shifts. And we have to, but in the short-term one, we have to have a specific thing that we're recommending so that the CEO people who can evaluate it say, well, I hear everybody says we should be doing this. And that's the way we get progress going. And that gets us inside the tent. And then we can start having relationships with these people, and we can start educating them from the inside rather than from the outside. And I don't believe awareness is that big of a problem because it's taking care of itself. When you have a water district, you know, that's got hacked and it changed the, you know, chemical content of the water. You've got solar winds. I mean, we're getting plenty of help on awareness. But what we don't have is a clear message that is digestible by CEOs and advisors to CEOs.
Yeah, I agree with you there. Please, if you have any comments from the audience or questions, please enter those into the Q&A. We have about 10 minutes left. Sort of building on that triad of people, processes, and technology, let's talk a little bit about processes. These aren't things that people get really excited talking about, things like setting policies and procedures. But to me, they can really save you, you know, in the event of a ransomware attack, for example. If you don't have a plan on how to respond to that attack, that could end up costing you a lot of money and a lot of downtime. What are your thoughts on implementing policies and procedures and so forth? And John, I see you're ready to comment, so we'll start with you.
Well, I did some work. I should say I had some compatriots at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab that did some work on this, and they did some studies to determine how long it took to detect and respond to incidents, and it was shocking. I mean, from days to weeks to months. I mean, probably not shocking to this group, but when you look at it across a whole host of companies, the lag time between discerning you have a problem and actually taking steps is measured in days and weeks. And so that's where a lot of APL's work, and I think the industry went in terms of orchestration, in terms of trying to look across various systems and sensors to develop a real-time operational picture of your network, and then to try to collapse the response times down. So yes, you need to have the whole, you know, in the DoD world, this the kill chain. You have to be able to detect. You have to have procedures on how to respond, and you have to try to compress that to literally minutes would be ideal. But most companies fail fairly miserably at this from the work that I was associated with. I think it's improved, but I don't think nearly enough.
John, did you ever have a disaster recovery plan or work with a FMEA chart to have actions in place?
Yes, and that's another piece of it, of course, to have a disaster recovery plan. Now, I mean, I think again, this is a good example of bringing the attention to the C-suite. You know, from the insurance industry standpoint, they want to see these kinds of things, and so it's driven a response by companies. But having a disaster recovery plan is only like one piece of your response posture.
I think the other challenge a little bit can be, exactly, people want to see this, your customers want to see it, and people end up having these big piles of dead trees that you don't use. If you have a process which is just, it lives in a document but you don't follow it, you know, it's a good marketing document but it's not doing anything else. So I always say, you know, start simple, start with the basics and get something that works and then iterate. Otherwise you just end up with, I've got these, you know, this huge pile of things to do and none of them happen.
Yep.
But in particular, one of the good things about a process is it can help take some of the expectation and blame. So you can say, let's assume that malware got onto our system. What are we going to do about it? And then you plan from that point forward, rather than saying it's not going to happen, it's unlikely, I don't want to think about it. You know, which is a classic thing that everybody does.
Well, and the other thing too is I agree 100%, but keep it simple. And then also identify owners.
Yeah.
Owners of each piece of the puzzle, because you got to make somebody responsible for it. Otherwise, it's not going to get done.
Absolutely.
Right, exactly.
So-
What?
Go
Oh,
ahead, one
sorry.
more
Go ahead, Anthony.
So when we talked about all security policies and disaster recovery plans, and it, like Richard said, it could be great marketing or fulfill a need on an audit, and you get the check mark. But if you don't validate what you set up in these policies and your backup procedures, can you actually recover data that you were backing up? Will it even work? And how long will that take? So validating these policies and disaster recovery plans is another key component. I know we talk about a lot, and there's only so much time we could get into everything, but
Yeah.
validating is key. That I've worked with companies that had a DR plan that they copied offline and filled in the blanks, and we went in there and nobody had ownership, and they actually didn't even know where their backups resided. So
I bet we've all got stories of people trying to recover from backups only to discover the backup isn't. Yeah, it just happens all the time. If you haven't recovered from backup, you don't have a backup. You just think you've got a backup.
This is also an area where you could learn something from the physical security world. I used to marvel. I come actually more out of a practitioner physical security side of the house than a cyber side of the house, but yet, you know, the physical side of the house has been doing exercising and security audits for those long as as long as you can imagine. And so
there were castles.
yeah, so the cyber side could learn a thing or two about that. And one of the things I used to try to do was people would say, "Oh, we have to have a cybersecurity exercise," and they would look at it as additive and say, "Well, we're already doing a hurricane exercise and a pandemic exercise and a this and a that." I says, "No. I says, "You just need to have a cyber component within stuff that you're already exercising." And that the light bulb went off, and they said, "Well, now we can imagine that we lost our data center during the course of this flooding event. So it's a hurricane exercise with a flooding event, but we tacked on, we lost the data center. Now what are you going to do?" So
Right.
we could take a page out of the physical security world there.
Hey, let's talk about devices for a second. And this is something I've wanted to get to. And I know, Joel, you're going to want to comment on this. And again, the SolarWinds attack, I think, is a good example of how things are vulnerable, I think, all the way down to the device level. And when I say device, I think a lot of cybersecurity practitioners mean things like PLCs and controllers, but what we're talking about is actually sensors and actuators that control physical processes within buildings. And I think one of the vulnerabilities that was exposed with the SolarWinds attack was that, the SolarWinds software actually controls stuff all the way down to this sensor and actuator level. Does anybody have any comments on what is the state of security down to the device, sensor and actuator level? What are some of the things that we need to worry about, or should we be concerned about cybersecurity at the sensor level? What can we do there? Is it really a concern? Feel free to jump in. This will be our last question.
Yeah, the answer is yes. It's definitely a concern, and it's basically unsecured. You think of analog to digital converter. I mean, and heat sensors and motion sensors. And there are tools out there in technology to secure them. They're a little pricey for what you look at a $35 device and you look at the security for it. It's like pretty impressive, the difference. It's a little stunning, but they're there. But they're overlooked. They're overlooked. Almost.
I would say I agree, but it is beginning to get better. So I work closely with ARM, and most of the technology we do as a company is for sort of cell phone sized devices or larger. So relatively big, relatively expensive, powerful devices. But ARM took their security architecture, which is called Trustzone, which allows them to run a secure operating system next to the regular operating system. And they have squeezed that all the way down to the $1 devices. So we did a project with Microchip where we put these, they're called trusted execution environments, onto a $1 controller. So these $1, this is the MCU. It's a dollar MCU. It's got a unique identity. It's got a cryptographic engine. It's got a secure operating system. So it can be done, but they're in the next generation of devices. You know, it's getting better, but today there's very little security. But it can happen, and it can happen on any size. There's no excuse to say a device is too small to secure, in the future at least.
Yeah.
But,
we do a lot of work at Skyline in the video world, and I think it's getting better because, but you also have to consider that the video camera is really a sensor at the end of the day, but it's a fairly sophisticated one. And between the move to try to do more computing at the edge, those devices are getting smarter. And as part of that, you can build more trust and more encryption authentication into the endpoint device. So I think it depends as to the sensor and the price and how much you're investing into that. But I also would say that's also where you can leverage the integration layer to take a class of devices and aggregate them through one location or two locations where you can overlay some security on top of what is essentially a dumb device. So there's techniques that, and certainly the next generation, as Richard said, is going to be better, but there's some things you can do now.
John, you hit a good point there on some of the devices and sensors are having encryption and authentication keys so that they communicate with the server and are identified with a pre-key. So they are already known when they're taken out to the field as recognized and authorized to sign on. So it is improving, and there's more and more, and I'm seeing this in different wireless frequencies and protocols. So not fully there yet, but there is more momentum behind cybersecurity with devices and sensors.
So my focus is primarily legacy stuff. I mean, I'm trying to fix the bad, the bad old stuff. So, I mean, I don't want to sound, like just throw it out there, but I mean, it's really the only thing you can do right now with those things is to protect the perimeter and get your people a little smarter. I mean, that's really at the end of the day on the legacy stuff, what you got to do.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, we don't have any more time. We're already a little bit over. I knew it was not going to be a problem filling this hour and a half with a really good panel discussion with so many good panelists that we have at Industry Experts. So I want to thank you all today for participating. I thought it was a great discussion. I want to thank everybody also for showing up to listen. If you do have any more questions, if you go to the ARC VFair site, there is a tab on the top networking bar or top bar rather that says networking. And you can go down there and enter the various chat channels. And if you want to ask questions or engage with some of the other people here, that's a great way to do that. Please join our next session, which is coming up at 2:30 p.m. Eastern time on the future electric grid. But until then, I want to thank everybody again. A great discussion. We look forward to having you back next year, and we'll talk to you soon. Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.